All right, guys, so what we're going to do now is create a boilerplate, a Webpack boilerplate or starter kit, whatever you want to call it, that you can use as a front-end development environment for future projects. And we're actually going to use this to refactor our track calorie project. Now, I created something like this a while ago that I've used a few times actually in actual projects. And I have this at my GitHub page here, and it's this Webpack starter repo. So I created this, what was it, about 9 months ago. And what we're going to build is very similar to this. So I'm actually not going to put the one we're going to build on GitHub because I have one that's very similar. We're not going to include like the SAS loader, so a couple other things too, but it's basically the same thing. It works the same way. Now, the one that we create, I will put in the resources for this particular video. So if you want to download it, you can, but we're going to go ahead and create it from scratch. So let's start off by just creating a new folder. I'm just going to put mine on my desktop, and I'm going to call this Webpack-starter. And then I'm going to open that up with VS Code or whatever text editor you're using. And remember, we're going to have a source folder, so src. Let's create that. And that's going to be all of our source code. So any JavaScript that we write is going to go in there. And then we'll have a dist folder that ultimately Webpack will create automatically when we run our build command. All right, but for now, I'm going to manually put my index.html in here. Okay, so remember the dist, this is your production code. So this is what would go to the server. And we haven't installed Webpack or anything like that just yet. We're going to do that very soon. But let's just create a basic boilerplate here. We'll say Webpack starter. Then we'll create an H1, and same thing, we'll just say Webpack starter. Now, as far as the JavaScript that I want to include here, let's say script source. I'm going to set it to main.js for now, which doesn't exist, but it's the file that Webpack is going to generate for us. Let's also throw defer in there since I'm putting it in the head. All right, so ultimately we'll be using something called the Webpack Dev Server, which is a plugin. But for now, I'm just going to go live with Live Server so that we can at least just see the HTML. And we're going to have an error because main.js doesn't actually exist yet. So we'll come back to that. Now, in our source folder, I'm going to create a new file called index.js. And this is basically our entry point for our application, for our source code. Now, before I go ahead and create another file and import it as a module, I'm going to install Webpack. So let's open up our console here, the terminal. So we're going to say npm install, and I'm actually going to install Webpack as a dev dependency. Pretty much anything we install here, loaders, plugins, they're all dev dependencies. They're not things that are needed for production, right? The production files are going to be in the dist folder. So I'm going to add a -D for a dev dependency. And right now we're going to install Webpack and also Webpack-CLI, which is the command line interface so that we can use Webpack commands in our scripts. So let's go ahead and run that. And in our package.json, you should now see a dev dependencies object with Webpack and Webpack CLI. All right. Now, as far as configuration, like I said, we need to have a Webpack config file, but I'm not going to do that just yet. What I do want is to just add a very simple script. So we don't need tests. So I'm going to change that to build. And then let's get rid of the stuff in here. And what I want this to do is run Webpack. And I'm also going to set the mode to production. Okay, because we can manually set flags here as well. So we'll do that, and then in our index.js, actually, you know what we'll do is create a new file because I just want to show you that we can now use modules. So we'll call this message.js. I'm not going to keep this. We'll get rid of it after, but we'll just create a simple object, and let's say ID1 and text. We'll set that to hello world, and then I'm going to export this. And we're using ES module syntax. So let's say export default message. All right, now I'm going to import that into my index.js. So let's say import message from /message, and then we'll just do a console log of message. All right, now what we want to do is run this script, this build script. So remember, to run these, we do npm run. So let's go ahead and go into our terminal, and let's say npm run build. All right, so now notice that in the console, we're no longer getting an error. We're logging our message. And over here, you can see that Webpack compiled successfully. And if we look in dist, there's now this main.js folder, which is a file that includes whatever functionality we have in our source folder, but just bundled into a single file that we're including into our HTML. Now, this is probably the simplest. It is the simplest configuration that you can have with Webpack, because we don't even have a config file. With Webpack 5, I think it was 5, they made it so that you literally don't have to have a config file for it to work. You used to have to. But we're going to go ahead and create ours now. So we want to put this in the root. You don't want to put it in source or dist. You want to have this in your root. So we're going to call it webpack.config.js. And basically what this is just it's just an object that we're going to export. Now, the config file actually uses common JS syntax, so keep that in mind. So we're going to say module.exports. This is the only file like in our environment that will use this type of syntax. So here we can set things like the mode. So I'm going to actually set the mode to development. Now, if you remember in our package.json, we set the mode here to production. So I'm actually going to just get rid of that, and all this is going to run is Webpack. So we'll save that. And then back in our config file, I'm just going to add the entry point. I mean, by default, it uses source index as the entry, but if you wanted to set it to something else, you could. But it's a good idea to just add this in here. So entry. And that's going to be our source. Let's say /source/ and then index.js. Okay, so that's the entry point. Then for the output, let's say output, and we can actually set this to an object. And I'm going to set the path. So the path is going to be the dist folder. And I'm actually going to bring in the path module. So Node.js has a path module built in. And this will just allow us to use absolute path names and things like that. So let's say require, because remember this particular file is common.js. And then for path, I'm going to use the path.resolve method. And this just allows us to use absolute file paths. And then there's this _dir name that we can use. And this just refers to the current directory. So from the current directory, then we want to point to the dist folder. Okay, so all this is doing right here is saying, well, the path that we're using for output is this dist folder. And then we can also, excuse me, we can change the file name if we want. So I'm going to put a comma here and go on to the next line. And I'm going to say file name. By default, it's main.js, but I like to use bundle. So I'm going to say bundle.js. All right, so that's all I'm going to add to the config for now. So we'll go ahead and save that. And then I'm going to delete the main.js file. And you'll see that this no longer works. And in the index.html, I'm going to change main.js to bundle.js because that's what's going to be created. So now let's come down here and let's run npm run build again. And now you see this works. And if we look in our dist, we now have a bundle.js. And this is in development mode, so that's why you see all this extra stuff here for debugging reasons and stuff. When we had it in production, you saw it was much shorter. But yeah, so that will generate npm run build is going to generate your bundle.js. Now every time, the way we have it now, every time we make a change, we have to run it again. So if I let's say console log message.text, if I save, and even if I reload, it's still giving me the object because I need to rebuild it. So I'd have to run npm run build again, and now it's just logging the text. Okay. Now, I'm going to show you later on how we can install the Webpack Dev Server plugin so that we don't have to do that. It'll just be a server, much like Live Server, that will auto reload and so on. All right, and then the last thing I want to do in this video, because this is just, it's a very basic setup, but it is working. But the last thing that I want to do is in the root, we want to create a .git ignore. Because remember, we have this node modules folder. When we push to GitHub or anywhere else, we don't want node modules included. And we also don't want dist included. All right, the way we have it right now, we would have to have dist in our index.html, right? Because then there's no HTML file. But later on, we're going to use an HTML plugin that will generate this file for us. So we don't need to include the dist. Just like I showed you with the actual project that I have here on GitHub, there is no dist folder because it's automatically created. So we don't want to include that when we push to GitHub or anywhere else. All right, so we'll save that, close it up. And in the next video, I'm going to show you how we can add CSS loaders so that we can import CSS files into our JavaScript.